Of the manner in which the persecutors died, by Lactantius, Part 2. Having thus attained to the highest power, he bent his mind to afflict that empire into which he had opened his way. It is the manner and practice of the Persians for the people to yield themselves slaves to their kings, and for the kings to treat their people as slaves. This flagitious man, from the time of his victories over the Persians, was not ashamed incessantly to extol such an institution, and he resolved to establish it in the Roman dominions. And because he could not do this by an express law, he so acted in imitation of the Persian kings as to bereave men of their liberties. He first of all degraded those whom he meant to punish, and then not only were inferior magistrates put to the torture by him, but also the chief men in cities and persons of the most eminent rank, and this too in matters of little moment and in civil questions. Crucifixion was the punishment ready prepared in capital cases, and for lesser crimes, fetters. Matrons of honourable station were dragged into workhouses, and when any man was to be scourged, there were 4 posts fixed in the ground, and to them he was tied, after a manner unknown in the chastisement of slaves. What shall I say of his apartment for sport, and of his favourite diversions? He kept bears, most resembling himself in fierceness and bulk, whom he had collected together during the course of his reign. As often as he chose to indulge his humour, he ordered some particular bear to be brought in, and men were thrown to that savage animal, rather to be swallowed up than devoured. And when their limbs were torn asunder, he laughed with excessive complacency, nor did he ever sup without being spectator of the effusion of human blood. Men of private station were condemned to be burnt alive, and he began this mode of execution by edicts against the Christians, commanding that after torture and condemnation they should be burnt at a slow fire. They were fixed to a stake, and first a moderate flame was applied to the soles of their feet, until the muscles, contracted by burning, were torn from the bones. Then torches, lighted and put out again, were directed to all the members of their bodies, so that no part had any exemption. Meanwhile, cold water was continually poured on their faces, and their mouths moistened, lest, by reason of their jaws being parched, they should expire. At length they did expire, when, after many hours, the violent heat had consumed their skin and penetrated into their intestines. The dead carcasses were laid on a funeral pile and wholly burnt. Their bones were gathered, ground to powder, and thrown into the river or into the sea. And now that cruelty, which he had learned in torturing the Christians, became habitual, and he exercised it against all men indiscriminately. He was not wont to inflict the slighter sorts of punishment, as to banish, to imprison, or to send criminals to work in the mines, but to burn, to crucify, to expose to wild beasts, were things done daily and without hesitation. For smaller offences, those of his own household and his stewards were chastised with lances instead of rods, and in great offences, to be beheaded was an indulgence shown to very few, and it seemed as a favour on account of old services, when one was permitted to die in the easiest manner. But these were slight evils in the government of Galerius when compared with what follows. For eloquence was extinguished, pleaders cut off, and the learned in the laws either exiled or slain. Useful letters came to be viewed in the same light as magical and forbidden arts, and all who possessed them were trampled upon and execrated as if they had been hostile to government and public enemies. Law was dissolved, and unbounded license permitted to judges chosen from among the soldiery, rude and illiterate men, and let loose upon the provinces without assessors to guide or control them. But that which gave rise to public and universal calamity was the tax imposed at once on each province and city, surveyors having been spread abroad and occupied in a general and severe scrutiny. Horrible scenes were exhibited, like the outrages of victorious enemies and the wretched state of captives. Each spot of ground was measured, vines and fruit trees numbered, lists taken of animals of every kind, and a capitation roll made up. In cities, the common people, whether residing within or without the walls, were assembled, the marketplaces filled with crowds of families, all attended with their children and slaves. The noise of torture and scourges resounded. Sons were hung on the rack to force discovery of the effects of their fathers. The most trusty slaves compelled by pain to bear witness against their masters, and wives to bear witness against their husbands. In default of all other evidence, men were tortured to speak against themselves, and no sooner did agony oblige them to acknowledge what they had not, but those imaginary effects were noted down in the lists. Neither youth, nor old age, nor sickness afforded any exemption. The diseased and the infirm were carried in. The age of each was estimated, and that the capitation tax might be enlarged, years were added to the young and struck off from the old. General lamentation and sorrow prevailed. Whatever, by the laws of war, conquerors had done to the conquered, the like did this man presume to perpetrate against Romans and the subjects of Rome, because his forefathers had been made liable to a like tax imposed by the victorious Trajan as a penalty on the Dacians for their frequent rebellions. After this, money was levied for each head, as if a price had been paid for liberty to exist, yet full trust was not reposed on the same set of surveyors but others, and others still were sent round to make further discoveries. And thus the tributes were redoubled, not because the new surveyors made any fresh discoveries, but because they added at pleasure to the former rates, lest they should seem to have been employed to no purpose. Meanwhile the number of animals decreased, and men died. Nevertheless, taxes were paid even for the dead, so that no one could either live or cease to live without being subject to impositions. There remained mendicants alone, from whom nothing could be exacted, and whom their misery and wretchedness secured from ill treatment. But this pious man had compassion on them, and determining that they should remain no longer in indigence, he caused them all to be assembled, put on board vessels, and sunk in the sea. So merciful was he in making provision that under his administration no man should want. And thus, while he took effectual measures that none, under the reigned pretext of poverty, should elude the tax, he put to death a multitude of real wretches in violation of every law of humanity. Already the judgment of God approached him, and that season ensued in which his fortunes began to droop and to waste away. While occupied in the manner that I have described above, he did not set himself to subvert or expel Constantius, but waited for his death, not imagining, however, that it was so near. Constantius, having become exceedingly ill, wrote to Galerius and requested that his son Constantine might be sent to see him. He had made a like request long before, but in vain, for Galerius meant nothing less than to grant it. On the contrary, he laid repeated snares for the life of that young man, because he dared not use open violence, lest he should stir up civil wars against himself, and incur that which he most dreaded, the hate and resentment of the army. Under pretense of manly exercise and recreation, he made him combat with wild beasts. But this device was frustrated, for the power of God protected Constantine, and in the very moment of jeopardy rescued him from the hands of Galerius. At length Galerius, when he could no longer avoid complying with the request of Constantius, one evening gave Constantine a warrant to depart, and commanded him to set out next morning with the imperial dispatches. Galerius meant either to find some pretext for detaining Constantine or to forward orders to Severus for arresting him on the road. Constantine discerned his purpose, and therefore after supper, when the emperor had gone to rest, he hasted away, carried off from the principal stages all the horses maintained at the public expense, and escaped. Next day the emperor, having purposely remained in his bedchamber until noon, ordered Constantine to be called into his presence. But he learned that Constantine had set out immediately after supper. Outrageous with passion, he ordered horses to be made ready, that Constantine might be pursued and dragged back, and hearing that all the horses had been carried off from the great road, he could hardly refrain from tears. Meanwhile, Constantine, journeying with incredible rapidity, reached his father, who was already about to expire. Constantius recommended his son to the soldiers, delivered the sovereign authority into his hands, and then died, as his wish had long been, in peace and quiet. Constantine Augustus, having assumed the government, made it his first care to restore the Christians to the exercise of their worship and to their God, and so began his administration by reinstating the holy religion. Some few days after, the portrait of Constantine, adorned with laurels, was brought to the pernicious wild beast, that by receiving that symbol he might acknowledge Constantine in the quality of emperor. He hesitated long whether to receive it or not, and he was about to commit both the portrait and its bearer to the flames. But his confidants dissuaded him from a resolution so frantic. They admonished him of the danger, and they represented that, if Constantine came with an armed force, all the soldiers, against whose inclination obscure or unknown Caesars had been created, would acknowledge him, and crowd eagerly to his standard. So Galerius, although with the utmost unwillingness, accepted the portrait and sent the imperial purple to Constantine, that he might seem of his own accord to have received that prince into partnership of power with him. And now his plans were deranged, and he could not, as he intended formerly, admit Licinius without exceeding the limited number of emperors. But this he devised, that Severus, who was more advanced in life, should be named emperor, and that Constantine, instead of the title of emperor to which he had been named, should receive that of Caesar in common with Maximidia, and so be degraded from the second place to the fourth. Things seemed to be arranged in some measure to the satisfaction of Galerius, when another alarm was brought, that his son-in-law Lactantius had been declared emperor at Rome. The cause was this: Galerius, having resolved by permanent taxes to devour the empire, soared to such extravagance and folly as not to allow an exemption from that thraldom even to the Roman people. Tax gatherers, therefore, were appointed to go to Rome and make out lists of the citizens. Much about the same time, Galerius had reduced the Praetorian Guards. There remained at Rome a few soldiers of that body who, profiting of the opportunity, put some magistrates to death, and, with the acquiescence of the tumultuary populace, clothed Lactantius in the imperial purple. Galerius, on receiving this news, was disturbed at the strangeness of the event, but not much dismayed. He hated Lactantius, and he could not bestow on him the dignity of Caesar already enjoyed by two, Dia and Constantine. Besides, he thought it enough for him to have once bestowed that dignity against his inclination. So he sent for Severus, exhorted him to regain his dominion and sovereignty, and he put under his command that army which Maximian Herculius had formerly commanded, that he might attack Lactantius at Rome. There the soldiers of Maximian had been oftentimes received with every sort of luxurious accommodation, so that they were not only interested to preserve the city, but they also longed to fix their residence in it. Lactantius well knew the enormity of his own offences, and although he had, as it were, an hereditary claim to the services of his father's army, and might have hoped to draw it over to himself, yet he reflected that this consideration might occur to Galerius also, and induce him to leave Severus in Illyricum and march in person with his own army against Rome. Under such apprehensions, Maxentius sought to protect himself from the danger that hung over him. To his father, who since his abdication resided in Campania, he sent the purple and saluted him again, Augustus. Maximian, given to change, eagerly resumed that purple of which he had unwillingly divested himself. Meanwhile Severus marched on, and with his troops approached the walls of the city. Presently the soldiers raised up their ensigns, abandoned Severus, and yielded themselves to Maxentius, against whom they had come. What remained but flight for Severus thus deserted? He was encountered by Maximian, who had resumed the imperial dignity. On this he took refuge in Ravenna, and shut himself up there with a few soldiers. But perceiving that he was about to be delivered up, he voluntarily surrendered himself and restored the purple to him from whom he had received it. And after this he obtained no other grace but that of an easy death, for he was compelled to open his veins, and in that gentle manner expired. But Maximian, who knew the outrageous temper of Galerius, began to consider that, fired with rage on hearing of the death of Severus, he would march into Italy, and that possibly he might be joined by Dia, and so bring into the field forces too powerful to be resisted. Having therefore fortified Rome and made diligent provision for a defensive war, Maximian went into Gaul, that he might give his younger daughter Fausta in marriage to Constantine, and thus win over that prince to his interest. Meantime, Galerius assembled his troops, invaded Italy, and advanced towards Rome, resolving to extinguish the Senate and put the whole people to the sword. But he found everything shut and fortified against him. There was no hope of carrying the place by storm, and to besiege it was an arduous undertaking, for Galerius had not brought with him an army sufficient to invest the walls. Probably having never seen Rome, he imagined it to be little superior in size to those cities with which he was acquainted. But some of his legions, detesting the wicked enterprise of a father against his son-in-law, and of Romans against Rome, renounced his authority and carried over their ensigns to the enemy. Already had his remaining soldiers begun to waver, when Galerius, dreading a fate like that of Severus, and having his haughty spirit broken and humiliated, threw himself at the feet of his soldiers, and continued to beseech them that he might not be delivered to the foe, until, by the promise of mighty largesses, he prevailed on them. Then he retreated from Rome, and fled in great disorder. Easily might he have been cut off in his flight, had any one pursued him even with a small body of troops. He was aware of his danger, and allowed his soldiers to disperse themselves, and to plunder, and destroy far and wide, that, if there were any pursuers, they might be deprived of all means of subsistence in a ruined country. So, the parts of Italy through which that pestilent band took its course were wasted, all things pillaged, matrons forced, virgins violated, parents and husbands compelled by torture to disclose where they had concealed their goods, and their wives and daughters. Flocks and herds of cattle were driven off like spoils taken from barbarians. And thus did he, once a Roman emperor, but now the ravager of Italy, retire into his own territories, after having afflicted all men indiscriminately with the calamities of war. Long ago, indeed, and at the very time of his obtaining sovereign power, he had avowed himself the enemy of the Roman name, and he proposed that the empire should be called not the Roman, but the Dacian Empire. After the flight of Galerius, Maximian, having returned from Gaul, held authority in common with his son. But more obedience was yielded to the young man than to the old, for Maxentius had most power, and had been longest in possession of it, and it was to him that Maximian owed on this occasion the imperial dignity. The old man was impatient at being denied the exercise of uncontrolled sovereignty, and envied his son with a childish spirit of rivalry, and therefore he began to consider how he might expel Lactantius and resume his ancient dominion. This appeared easy, because the soldiers who deserted Severus had originally served in his own army. He called an assembly of the people of Rome and of the soldiers, as if he had been to make an harangue on the calamitous situation of public affairs. After having spoken much on that subject, he stretched his hands towards his son, charged him as author of all ills and prime cause of the calamities of the state, and then tore the purple from his shoulders. Lactantius, thus stripped, leaped headlong from the tribunal, and was received into the arms of the soldiers. Their rage and clamour confounded the unnatural old man, and like another Tarquin the Proud, he was driven from Rome. Then Maximian returned into Gaul, and after having made some stay in those quarters, he went to Galerius, the enemy of his son, that they might confer together, as he pretended, about the settlement of the commonweal. But his true purpose was, under colour of reconciliation, to find an opportunity of murdering Galerius and of seizing his share of the empire instead of his own, from which he had been everywhere excluded. Diocles was at the court of Galerius when Maximian arrived, for Galerius, meaning now to invest Licinius with the ensigns of supreme power in the room of Severus, had lately sent for Diocles to be present at the solemnity. So it was performed in presence both of him and of Maximian, and thus there were 6 who ruled the empire at one and the same time. Now the designs of Maximian having been frustrated, he took flight as he had done twice before, and returned into Gaul, with a heart full of wickedness, and intending by treacherous devices to overreach Constantine, who was not only his own son-in-law, but also the child of his son-in-law, and that he might the more successfully deceive, he laid aside the imperial purple. The Franks had taken up arms. Maximian advised the unsuspecting Constantine not to lead all his troops against them, and he said that a few soldiers would suffice to subdue those barbarians. He gave this advice that an army might be left for him to win over to himself, and that Constantine, by reason of his scanty forces, might be overpowered. The young prince believed the advice to be judicious, because given by an aged and experienced commander, and he followed it, because given by a father-in-law. He marched, leaving the most considerable part of his forces behind. Maximian waited a few days, and as soon as, by his calculation, Constantine had entered the territory of the barbarians, he suddenly resumed the imperial purple, seized the public treasures, after his wont made ample donatives to the soldiery, and feigned that such disasters had befallen Constantine as soon after befell himself. Constantine was presently informed of those events, and, by marches astonishingly rapid, he flew back with his army. Maximian, not yet prepared to oppose him, was overpowered at unawares, and the soldiers returned to their duty. Maximian had possessed himself of Marseilles. He fled there, and shut the gates. Constantine drew near, and seeing Maximian on the walls, addressed him in no harsh or hostile language, and demanded what he meant, and what it was that he wanted, and why he had acted in a way so peculiarly unbecoming him. But Maximian from the walls incessantly uttered abuse and curses against Constantine. Then, of a sudden, the gates on the opposite side having been unbarred, the besiegers were admitted into the city. The rebel emperor and unnatural parent, and a perfidious father-in-law, was dragged into the presence of Constantine, heard a recital made of his crimes, was divested of his imperial robe, and, after this reprimand, obtained his life. Maximian, having thus forfeited the respect due to an emperor and a father-in-law, grew impatient at his abased condition, and, emboldened by impunity, formed new plots against Constantine. He addressed himself to his daughter Fausta, and, as well by entreaties as by the soothing of flattery, solicited her to betray her husband. He promised to obtain for her a more honourable alliance than that with Constantine, and he requested her to allow the bedchamber of the emperor to be left open and to be slightly guarded. Fausta undertook to do whatever he asked, and instantly revealed the whole to her husband. A plan was laid for detecting Maximian in the very execution of his crime. They placed a base eunuch to be murdered instead of the emperor. At the dead of night, Maximian arose and perceived all things to be favorable for his insidious purpose. There were few soldiers on guard, and these too at some distance from the bedchamber. However, to prevent suspicion, he accosted them and said that he had had a dream which he wished to communicate to his son-in-law. He went in armed, slew the eunuch, sprung forth exultingly, and avowed the murder. At that moment Constantine showed himself on the opposite side with a band of soldiers. The dead body was brought out of the bedchamber. The murderer, taken in the fact, all aghast, stood like a stone, silent and motionless, while Constantine upbraided him for his impiety and enormous guilt. At last Maximian obtained leave that the manner of his death should be at his own choice, and he strangled himself. Thus that mightiest sovereign of Rome, who ruled so long with exceeding glory, and who celebrated his 20th anniversary, thus that most haughty man had his neck broken, and ended his detestable life by a death base and ignominious. From Maximian, God, the avenger of religion and of his people, turned his eyes to Galerius, the author of the accursed persecution, that in his punishment also he might manifest the power of his majesty. Galerius too was purposing to celebrate his 20th anniversary, and as, under that pretext, he had by new taxes payable in gold and silver oppressed the provinces, so now, that he might recompense them by celebrating the promised festival, he used the like pretext for repeating his oppressions. Who can relate in fit terms the methods used to harass mankind in levying the tax, and especially with regard to grain and the other fruits of the earth? The officers, or rather the executioners, of all the different magistrates seized on each individual and would never let go their hold. No man knew to whom he ought to make payment first. There was no dispensation given to those who had nothing, and they were required, under pain of being variously tortured, instantly to pay, notwithstanding their inability. Many guards were set round, no breathing time was granted, or at any season of the year the least respite from exactions. Different magistrates, or the officers of different magistrates, frequently contended for the right of levying the tax from the same persons. No threshing floor without a tax gatherer, no vintage without a watch, and naught left for the sustenance of the husbandman. That food should be snatched from the mouths of those who had earned it by toil was grievous. The hope, however, of being afterwards relieved might have made that grievance supportable. But it was necessary for everyone who appeared at the anniversary festival to provide robes of various kinds, and gold and silver besides. And one might have said, "How shall I furnish myself with those things, O tyrant void of understanding, if you carry off the whole fruits of my ground, and violently seize its expected produce?" Thus, throughout the dominions of Galerius, men were spoiled of their goods, and all was raked together into the imperial treasury, that the emperor might be enabled to perform his vow of celebrating a festival which he was doomed never to celebrate. Maximin Daia was incensed at the nomination of Licinius to the dignity of emperor, and he would no longer be called Caesar or allow himself to be ranked as third in authority. Galerius, by repeated messages, besought Dia to yield and to acquiesce in his arrangement, to give place to age and to reverence the grey hairs of Licinius. But Dia became more and more insolent. He urged that as it was he who first assumed the purple, so by possession he had right to priority in rank. And he set at naught the entreaties and the injunctions of Galerius. That brute animal was stung to the quick, and bellowed when the mean creature whom he had made Caesar, in expectation of his thorough obsequiousness, forgot the great favour conferred on him, and impiously withstood the requests and will of his benefactor. Galerius at length, overcome by the obstinacy of Dia, abolished the subordinate title of Caesar, gave to himself and Licinius that of the Augusti, and to Dia and Constantine that of sons of the Augusti. Dia, some time after, in a letter to Galerius, took occasion to observe that at the last general muster he had been saluted by his army under the title of Augustus. Galerius, vexed and grieved at this, commanded that all the four should have the appellation of emperor, and now, when Galerius was in the 18th year of his reign, God struck him with an incurable plague. A malignant ulcer formed itself low down in his secret parts and spread by degrees. The physicians attempted to eradicate it and healed up the place affected. But the sore, after having been skinned over, broke out again, a vein burst, and the blood flowed in such quantity as to endanger his life. The blood, however, was stopped, although with difficulty. The physicians had to undertake their operations anew, and at length they cicatrized the wound. In consequence of some slight motion of his body, Galerius received a hurt, and the blood streamed more abundantly than before. He grew emaciated, pallid, and feeble, and the bleeding then stanched. The ulcer began to be insensible to the remedies applied, and a gangrene seized all the neighbouring parts. It diffused itself the wider the more the corrupted flesh was cut away, and everything employed as the means of cure served but to aggravate the disease. The masters of the healing art withdrew. Then famous physicians were brought in from all quarters, but no human means had any success. Apollo and Aesculapius were besought importunately for remedies. Apollo did prescribe, and the distemper augmented. Already approaching to its deadly crisis, it had occupied the lower regions of his body. His bowels came out, and his whole seat putrefied. The luckless physicians, although without hope of overcoming the malady, ceased not to apply poultices and administer medicines. The humours having been repelled, the distemper attacked his intestines, and worms were generated in his body. The stench was so foul as to pervade not only the palace, but even the whole city. And no wonder, for by that time the passages from his bladder and bowels, having been devoured by the worms, became indiscriminate, and his body, with intolerable anguish, was dissolved into one mass of corruption. Stung to the soul, he bellowed with the pain, so roars the wounded bull. Pit. They applied warm flesh of animals to the chief seat of the disease, that the warmth might draw out those minute worms, and accordingly, when the dressings were removed, there issued forth an innumerable swarm. Nevertheless, the prolific disease had hatched swarms much more abundant to prey upon and consume his intestines. Already, through a complication of distempers, the different parts of his body had lost their natural form. The superior part was dry, meagre, and haggard, and his ghastly-looking skin had settled itself deep among his bones, while the inferior, distended like bladders, retained no appearance of joints. These things happened in the course of a complete year, and at length, overcome by calamities, he was obliged to acknowledge God, and he cried aloud, in the intervals of raging pain, that he would re-edify the church which he had demolished, and make atonement for his misdeeds. And when he was near his end, he published an edict of the tenor following: Amongst our other regulations for the permanent advantage of the commonweal, we have hitherto studied to reduce all things to a conformity with the ancient laws and public discipline of the Romans. It has been our aim in a special manner that the Christians also, who had abandoned the religion of their forefathers, should return to right opinions. For such wilfulness and folly had, we know not how, taken possession of them, that instead of observing those ancient institutions which possibly their own forefathers had established, they, through caprice, made laws to themselves and drew together into different societies many men of widely different persuasions. After the publication of our edict, ordaining the Christians to betake themselves to the observance of the ancient institutions, many of them were subdued through the fear of danger, and moreover many of them were exposed to jeopardy nevertheless, because great numbers still persist in their opinions, and because we have perceived that at present they neither pay reverence and due adoration to the gods, nor yet worship their own God. Therefore we, from our wonted clemency in bestowing pardon on all, have judged it fit to extend our indulgence to those men, and to permit them again to be Christians, and to establish the places of their religious assemblies, yet so as that they offend not against good order. By another mandate we purpose to signify unto magistrates how they ought herein to demean themselves. Wherefore it will be the duty of the Christians, in consequence of this our toleration, to pray to their God for our welfare, and for that of the public, and for their own, that the commonweal may continue safe in every quarter, and that they themselves may live securely in their habitations. This edict was promulgated at Nicomedia on the day preceding the calends of May, in the 8th consulship of Galerius and the 2nd of Maximin Dia. Then the prison gates having been thrown open, you, my best beloved Donatus, together with the other confessors for the faith, were set at liberty from a jail, which had been your residence for 6 years. Galerius, however, did not, by publication of this edict, obtain the divine forgiveness. In a few days after he was consumed by the horrible disease that had brought on an universal putrefaction, dying, he recommended his wife and son to Licinius and delivered them over into his hands. This event was known at Nicomedia before the end of the month. His vicennial anniversary was to have been celebrated on the ensuing calends of March. Dia, on receiving this news, hasted with relays of horses from the east to seize the dominions of Galerius, and, while Licinius lingered in Europe, to arrogate to himself all the country as far as the narrow seas of Chalcedon. On his entry into Bithynia, he, with the view of acquiring immediate popularity, abolished Galerius's tax, to the great joy of all. Dissension arose between the two emperors, and almost an open war. They stood on the opposite shores with their armies. Peace, however, and amity were established under certain conditions. Licinius and Dia met on the narrow seas, concluded a treaty, and in token of friendship joined hands. Then Dia, believing all things to be in security, returned to Nicomedia, and was in his new dominions what he had been in Syria and Egypt.